Hello and welcome to the MoneyMagpie Invest Podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles, founder of MoneyMagpie, and today I'm joined by Elliot Keck from the TaxPayers Alliance. But before we say anything, I must just remind you to subscribe, follow us, like and do comment. We're very interested in the comments and always reply. And also do remember that anything that's said in this podcast should not be taken as financial advice. It's information only. Phew, got that out of the way. So now let's meet my guest, Elliot Keck, who is from the Taxpayers Alliance. Hello, Elliot.
Hello, good morning.
Now, I asked you to come onto the podcast because everybody is talking about taxation. Woo, exciting subject. But it's getting more and more exciting with this government. And particularly, I think, after their first budget last year. What would you say are the pros and cons of the taxes that have been imposed since the last budget? And then we'll talk about, the potential for the next budget.
Well, in terms of the last budget, I don't think there's any pros really. I think they picked the absolute worst taxes that you could increase and decided to go with them. Unfortunately, the reason why they did that is they sort of boxed them into this. They boxed themselves into this very difficult political situation where they ruled out increasing the three main revenue raises of tax, and that's VAT, income tax, and national insurance, and they did that because they thought they needed to do that in order to secure a mandate from the British electorate. But of course, that also meant that they ruled out essentially the three most effective revenue raisers, and also the three least damaging, the least distortionary revenue raisers as well. So all taxation is distortionary, all taxation is damaging. But if you have to raise tax, and of course you do have to raise tax, you do need a state, you do need some level of public services. Broad-based taxes on consumption and income are easily the best to go for, and they were the ones that they stepped away from, and as a result they had to raise taxes on, for example, hiring people and paying people through the national insurance on employers. They had to raise taxes on, for example, family farms and family businesses. They had to raise taxes on capital gains, VAT on private schools. So as a result of excluding those big, broad-based, largely non-distortionary taxes, they had to target, they had to target behaviours that actually you should want to incentivise, behaviours that are really important for growth.
But wouldn't it be harmful to increase income tax? Doesn't that put people off working?
Listen, as I said, all taxation is bad, and all taxation is damaging, and all taxation changes incentives in a negative way once you start to increase it. So obviously, we at the Taxpayers Alliance do not support any tax increases. We would not support any tax increases. Tax burden is far too high. However, from a purely sort of economics point of view, from a purely taxation point of view, if you're coming into government and you've made the decision that you need to raise a certain amount of revenue above and beyond what you're already raising, increasing some people's income tax is the least bad way to do it. There will be people at the margins that decide to leave employment, they decide to reduce the amount of employment. But actually, a lot of that is based on the marginal tax rates rather than the overall tax. So, for example, that 60p rate when you start to withdraw the personal allowance between £100,000 and £125,000, that is leading to people that fundamentally change their working practices. They go down from 5-day weeks, 4-day weeks, they don't take promotions, etc. However, if you were to do something like increase the 20p rate to 21p rate, it's unlikely you're going to get many people leaving the workforce as a result of that. Again, the 40 to 41p rates, unlikely you're going to get many people leaving the workforce. You'll get some, and that's damaging, but it's certainly not as damaging as, for example, increasing taxes on businesses, which is leading to businesses at best, simply changing their decisions on salaries, wages, bonuses, etc. And at worst, businesses are not hiring, and some businesses are even closing.
Now, you did point out rightly that we need tax. I mean, I think it's a mark of a civilized country that you have taxation that pays for services that we all use. But do you feel that this government has had a spend budget where they've been giving out money to all sorts, where actually we need to cut and probably cut a bit more?
Yeah, that's probably right. You spoke about the necessity of taxation in order to pay for public services. And of course, there are a whole range of public services that the government pays for, which actually contribute to the economy and that are actually fundamental for a healthy economy and for economic growth. So the really big obvious ones there are prisons. The more prison spaces you have, the more you're able to keep basically uncivilized people out of society. And the more people you're able to remove from society that shouldn't be in society, the healthier society is going to be, and that's good for the economy. Again, the better you're able to fund the court system, the more that, firstly you're able to deal with criminal activity, but also the quicker you're able to resolve civil cases, disputes, and all the rest of it. And again, that's really important for business confidence. Transport is another one where, again, the more the state invests in filling in potholes, the more the state invests in local transport infrastructure, you can actually have benefits to the wider economy. But the problem is our fiscal policy, and this is not just the Labour government, last government as well. Our fiscal policy and our spending decisions have prioritised what you'd broadly call the unproductive part of society and unproductive part of the state. And that's not to say that those bits of spending aren't important. Let's look at the obvious ones: pensioners, those out of work, and those the disabled, and also to some extent the broader public sector. Those are really, everyone wants to have a good pension system, everyone wants to have a good safety net, and there are a lot of people want the public sector to do more than just what's good for the economy. But obviously, in order to fund all of those things, you are taking a pound out of the pocket of someone who's going to use it for growth and entrepreneurialism and investment. You're taking a pound out of their pocket and you're giving that pound to someone that is not going to use that for economically valuable activity. They will just go out and spend it in the wider economy. So the problem is not just how much we're spending, it's how much of it is being focused on broadly unproductive parts of the economy that don't generate growth.
And we've seen in France what happens when a government tries to make cuts. I mean, the French government seems to have collapsed about 4 times so far since 2024.
The French have a habit of doing that, to be honest.
Yes, they do. But, I'm wondering, here we have, as you know, 52% of the populace taking from the system and only 40%.
Yeah, that's right.
Handing in. So that means that already we have more voters, essentially, who want to keep the status quo.
Yeah, and really what you're looking at in France is a failure to get a mandate to deliver these things. And that's something that we need to think about a lot. It's something that the Labour government completely failed to do. At no point during the last election were the Labour government talking openly and seriously about cutting welfare benefits, about cutting pensioner benefits. And as a result, when they tried to do so, they didn't have the mandate to push those things through. You can compare that to the 2010 government, 2010-2015, which is the last time we've had a government successfully reduce spending. And there are a lot of legitimate criticisms about the way that they went about reducing spending, reducing the size of the state. But they did reduce it over that 2010 to 2016 period. Public spending came down by a few percentage points as a percentage of GDP. But the key thing that government did in their 2010 election and also the 2015 election, they were absolutely abundantly clear with the public at every single stage that their project was going to be about reducing spending. And they also laid out in some broad details, maybe not as specific as they could have been, but in broad details where they were going to look at reducing spending. And as a result, they had the mandate for that. I mean, even when they ran into some difficult periods, they were able to continue with what they called their long-term economic plan. But what you're seeing in France and what you're seeing with this Labour government is they never went to the public to explain the need for fiscal retrenchment in terms of spending. And as a result, they've run into trouble.
Well, I suspect that this is going to be the same in the next budget, because I haven't heard anything, as you say. Nobody has said, well, we're going to have to retrench, we're going to have to make some serious cuts. All I'm hearing is that they're going to have some more taxes. They're going to keep the spending, possibly even increase it. Who knows?
Yeah.
But certainly, they're going to be increasing the taxes. What do you feel? Because we've heard all sorts of rumours, particularly about property-related taxes.
Yeah.
What do you feel reasonably we could expect for the next budget, which is not coming until the end of November? Weird, but there we are.
Yes, well, November 26th, I think, which is extraordinary. Listen, at the moment, they're in this pattern where they have decided that they need to raise a load of revenue. And I disagree that you need to raise revenue. I think you should be cutting spending. However, let's assume you can't do anything on spending and you need to raise a load of revenue. there's different figures being bandied about. Some are saying up to 50 billion, some people are saying 20 billion, but we're talking about a non-nugatory amount of money that needs to be raised, a significant amount of money that needs to be raised. Again, they're proceeding on the assumption that they can't touch income tax, they can't touch VAT, they can't touch national insurance as a result of those manifesto promises. And so again, they're in this space where they're looking around for potential revenue raisers. And again, as we come back to, that means that they're looking at actually taxing healthy, productive economic activity. And the big thing that they're looking at, and we know this because of the people that are in the Treasury and in Number 10 now, very resolution foundation oriented people, the thing that they're really looking at is property wealth. Obviously, as a result of the failure to build enough houses, as a result of quantitative easing, as a result of high levels of immigration, we've seen house prices across the country actually, but in particular obviously the southeast, soar well above, way above the sort of normal rate of inflation and growth in the economy. But the problem is tapping into that wealth is extraordinarily difficult and forces you to do a whole load of really, really bizarre and toxic things, like, for example, removing the relief on capital gains tax when you sell your primary residence. And that is something that has been floated. We're also seeing them talk about whether or not you can abolish stamp duty, which does seem to be an aspiration of theirs. But then you need to work out another way to fill that revenue. So they're talking about, for example, a property tax above £500,000, where you pay a percentage above £500,000. But again, you are essentially then targeting a lot of people who are asset rich but cash poor. A bit like they did with the farmers. You know, farmers they may get £10 million handed down to them in assets, but actually those assets are all tied up in farm property and farmland. And actually maybe their average income is only £40,000-50,000 a year. You know, it's very normal. And so at the moment, the things that they think could raise a lot of revenue are also easily some of the most toxic taxes that you can raise. And you've seen in some of the reactions to when those taxes are floated. So I honestly cannot make a prediction about what they're going to do, because their only option when you exclude income tax, VAT and national insurance are so toxic that it would be extraordinary if they actually went about it that way.
Of course, they have a huge majority. So if they came up with, the plans that have been touted, as you say, the property tax, the CGT taken off. There's also been national insurance charged on rental income potential as well. You know, there are all these sort of things. If those can go through, and I assume they could because of the huge majority, what could then the people do? If because that would affect quite a lot of, say, fairly powerful people. You know, would this mean people would take to the streets, or what do you think might happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, and the other one I think they may look at, and we know that something that Torsten Bell, who is believed to be writing the budget, absolutely believes in. He believes in placing a cap on the amount, a cap on the amount of tax-free money you can have in your ISA. So at the moment, you can save up to £20,000 a year, as I'm sure your listeners know, up to £20,000 a year tax-free, and then what you have in that ISA is then tax-free. And Torsten Bell wants to place a cap on that at £100,000. So once you have over £100,000 in your ISA, even if that's over, a decade of saving, maybe £5,000, £6,000, £7,000 a year, and then you get growth through investments and you have £100,000, he would then look at taxing anything above £100,000. Essentially, what you're talking about is you are going after essentially the middle class, the sort of the vaguely affluent, but they're not necessarily massively cash rich. They've really had to scrabble together every pound that they have to build that ISA. They have a property, but again, that's all of that wealth is tied up in that property. And I really think, given how much discontent there is already with what you might call Middle England, particularly over immigration, and you look at the way that people are coming out over migrant hotels and et cetera, and actually it's increasingly the broadly middle classes and the broadly vaguely affluent. I think you could be looking at a poll tax moment if you potentially look at these taxes. I think if people are seeing the government coming after their property and coming after their savings, it's not just enough that their income tax is, they pay 40p over £50,000. It's an extraordinary rate of tax. I really think you could be in a poll tax moment where you get absolutely massive protests. And you talk about the majority. I mean, that majority has failed to deliver cuts to benefits. It's failed to deliver cuts to pensioner benefits. And it's a very fragile and shallow majority. They got 33% of the vote. That is 3 percentage points less than David Cameron got in 2010 and quite a few percentage points less than Theresa May got in 2017. So I think it could be a very dangerous moment for them.
It does feel like it to me, because everything that we're hearing from behind the scenes at Number 10 is that they're in a mess, that they're in a state that there's a lot of infighting, general, solid essentially. So it does feel to me that if the people do decide to rise up, maybe the end of this year or next year, it could potentially topple the government. We could have a French Elysee Palace moment, perhaps.
Yeah, and already with the recent news about Peter Mandelson and Angela Rayner, you're already seeing a government that is teetering. And I think ultimately what they'll come to in the budget, and there's been no briefings about this, they haven't floated this yet, so I am sort of going out on a limb here, but I think the ultimate place where they'll get on the budget is they'll realise they need to do either national insurance on employees, income tax or VAT. And the easiest one for them to do would be national insurance on employees. Mm-hmm. 2 reasons for that. Firstly, you don't hit high voting pensioners and people with a lot of time on their hands. Mm-hmm. You can also spin it as a tax to pay directly for the NHS. And thirdly, you can spin it as not a tax cut, but a reversal, not a tax rise, sorry, a reversal of Jeremy Hunt's 2 rounds of national insurance tax cuts, which they can say that government, he never had the money for. Labour, tried valiantly to retain it, but they weren't able to do it. So there will be a way for them to spin it that I think you can tell a story about. They haven't started telling that story yet. I think November 26th is sufficiently far away that eventually they'll come to that conclusion. And what you can then do, you can then essentially, Keir Starmer can then blame Rachel Reeves for that. He can say that it was as a result of her ruling out national insurance, income tax and VAT that we're in this mess. Mm-hmm. I've made her atone for that mistake and increase national insurance, but now she's gone and we start afresh. So my instinct is that's where the government will end up, because I don't see any other options for them on the table.
So finally, Elliot, if you were in Rachel Reeves' position and nobody was pulling your strings, what would you do with this year's budget? What sort of elements would you bring in and what would you throw out?
Well, I mean, do I have Labour backbenchers to deal with?
Well, that's the problem, yes. Let's say you don't.
Well, if I didn't have Labour backbenchers to deal with, I would look at fundamental reform to our benefit system, both in work and working age benefits, but also pensioner benefits. I think we do need to start to look at the affordability of things like the triple lock, things like the winter fuel payment, things, but also the fact that we are now seeing 5-6-fold increases in the number of people claiming PIP and other benefits for things like mental health conditions. Mm-hmm. So I would think you need sweeping reform on those 2 things. I think you need sweeping reform to public sector pensions so that public sector workers are on defined contribution pensions rather than defined benefit, and there are a couple of other areas that you can look at, and then you can use that to cut and either ideally abolish some of the worst and most growth disincentivizing taxes. So in particular, you could look at something like getting rid of stamp duty, you can look at getting rid of inheritance tax, capital gains tax, cuts to corporation tax, and then if you needed to raise a little bit of revenue, I would then look alongside that, I would then look at extending VAT to more products, because at the moment we only raise about 50% of what we could in VAT if we applied it to everything. Other countries like New Zealand get more like 98%, they're almost VAT maximising. And the amount of revenue raised is extraordinary there without that much economic damage, and you could use that to, again, look at things like the 50,000 £1,000 40p rate of income tax, the 45p rate, the 60p rate. So I'd want to try and be as radical as possible, but you do have to keep an eye on the government finances. Our debt and debt interest is sufficiently high. You don't want to blow a massive hole in the finances. You do need any tax cuts to be matched by tax rises elsewhere or spending cuts.
Great. Elliot, thank you so much. Elliot Keck, who is Head of Campaigns at the Taxpayers Alliance. Really, really useful stuff. Now, remember, do like this, comment. I always have a look at the comments and I always reply. And do subscribe if you haven't already. And tell all your friends about the podcast. You know you want to. See you next week at the MoneyMagpie Invest Podcast.